La zona blanca.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's show. We're again progressing with our discussion from last week, where we discussed shame and the shame linking to depression as a result of shame within young people who may be in problems, maybe being bullied, maybe being picked on, misunderstood. That was the particular focus of our discussion around shame, but it did extend across the rest of the community, because shame, in terms of its negative and positive aspects, is important to note. Shame, if it becomes a pathological agenda for someone, is way over the board, and it can actually lead to very, very severe depression, perhaps even suicide. Shame, if it's used in a way which is moderate and balanced, actually could regulate you in terms of not committing sins, not acting against Sharia. So there are positive and negative aspects to these kind of human qualities, human emotional qualities, and human emotional intellect is something which is underestimated both within our community and beyond. There is a normal academic intellect which everybody acknowledges and aspires to and welcomes, and as well as celebrates. But the emotional intellect is often quite vague in people's minds. In a Western society where we're faced with increasing challenges to our identity, our culture, and our religious values, quite often emotional intellect is the area of our mind which is being attacked. Emotional intellect is something we require to be able to deal with the many plethora of problems that are being thrown at us on a psychological level every day. Those can be thrown up by mainstream society, they can be thrown up by our own personal problems. And often we're ashamed to talk about our problems, because our problems may become, in our own eyes, weaknesses which other people can exploit. From an Islamic perspective, of course, exploitation of people's weaknesses or building up sense of shame in order to take advantage of somebody's nature is obviously completely wrong, and it would be ostensibly a sin in itself. But I have with me today to discuss depression, the depression which leads from situations like shame, or attributes like shame, emotions like shame. It's again a pleasure to welcome Bilal Ali.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bilal, welcome to the show. Bilal works as a psychotherapist and is very professional in the world of counseling and understanding these issues from a scientific perspective, it has to be said. But let's not forget that Islam has its own solutions, its own spiritual healing, its own methods of prevention of depression and such things. We discussed prayer and dua as two forms of prevention, and we're going to expand on that a little as with the actual issue of depression as well. Bilal, what is depression?
Okay, from a Western point of view, depression is related to being low in mood, low in energy, having an aversion to activity, and essentially one who is depressed would be have the let's say the cognitive consequences of being depressed would be that they would think about life in a hopeless way. They would think about their skill set or their ability to lift themselves out of that situation as being inadequate, and they would probably more often than not isolate themselves. So that's the traits of depression.
Okay, now that's really important, because a lot of people would probably be in denial, I imagine, because it's one of those illnesses which is not obviously a physically damaging one in the sense of a wound.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't manifest itself in terms of some sort of physical irregularity.
Sure.
So therefore, people often will regard depression probably very lightly. They may not even know they suffer from it. Is that the case? Well, you're in the field. Do you find that people are aware of depression as much as they might be of a common symptom like a cold or something like that?
Actually, you hit on a good point in the sense that, yeah, oftentimes people are experiencing depression after assessment, but they never, on the surface, anticipated that that wasn't the psychological disposition that they were experiencing. I think that depression is a very wide subject. So you start from mild to moderate, which is just something to do with mood, and you work your way up, I guess, to the more extreme forms, which are caused by chemical imbalances. So there's different ways of addressing the various types of depression, which is like manic depression, where somebody has, you know, some people experience at a neurological level actual different hormones that are not in balance, and so that leads to very, very low moods and extreme forms of depression at times.
So it's not always because of an environmental factor. Depression can happen due to your own physical, chemical imbalances.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So again, another thing that may not obviously be detectable to an individual, they may feel that that's just them, and they may have been suffering from it for so long that it becomes almost part of their normal daily life routine.
Part of their persona, part of their personality, and not understanding quite often, why do I feel like this all the time? What is wrong with me? And then attributing the low mood to other things in life, as opposed to actually knowing that it's a clinical condition.
So a state of low mood and aversion to activity, not wanting to do anything, being lazy, lethargic. Those are one set of symptoms.
Yeah.
Anger. You mentioned anger as another symptom. Is that a very common one? People being very angry, perhaps.
Not necessarily with depression. With shame, yes. As we spoke about shame, that can be a reaction to anger. Aggression can be a reaction to shame. But whereas oftentimes people who are depressed, they are, I think, because of the lethargy, that they don't have, almost like saying they don't have the energy to be angry about things. So it's not that they can't be angry, but it's not commonly associated with depression.
And more symptoms. I mean, basically, they would go in on themselves, be very negative about life as a whole.
Right. So their interpretation of events would, they would tend. A person that's depressed often would reinforce their current state. So they would, when people are depressed, they tend to think about, because let's look at it from a, before we get, because I'd like to, inshallah, address it on the spiritual level, but if we just addressing it on a psychological level at the moment, we could look at it that, you know, depressive bouts are often on a psychological level triggered by loss or failure. So people lose a relationship, they lose a love, you know, they lose a particular person in their life, or they lose a job, but there's some sort of loss, or they failed, they wanted to accomplish a particular thing and they did not succeed. So that's a trigger. And then once when a person's in that sort of psychological state, it's easy for them to think of other losses or other failures, and then they have the type of mentality, develop the type of mentality where they interpretate things like that, saying, this always happens to me, you know, and they associate other losses and are unable to actually see the more beneficial parts of life, or to have a balanced view. They kind of have a bit of a warped perspective on life or interpretation.
So they can begin to underestimate themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And does that also invoke any other feelings? They're not necessarily antagonistic towards anybody. It's all about themselves being not good enough.
Yeah, and very much associated with hopelessness and helplessness. Those are the two.
So in its mildest form, is it treatable?
In depression, commonly, according to experts, according to the medics, depression is treatable with psychotherapy. I've worked many times with people who are experiencing depression. What's commonly associated with depression, you mentioned anger, is actually anxiety. They tend to be very much running together.
Anxious.
Anxiety.
So worrying about things.
Yes.
Fretting.
Yes.
Sort of building up problems to be maybe bigger than they are.
Exactly. So
and not being able to work out solutions.
So thinking themselves into a state, basically, just by the power of thought, but just negative interpretation, narrow interpretation, not seeing other parts of life. So very much treatable with psychotherapy. The behavior therapies like cognitive behavior therapy are known to be very successful in treating depression. Cognitive behavior therapy tends to be one of the more a lot of research, so it's scientifically measured, methods of treatment and so on and so forth.
And what does it involve, cognitive therapy?
Cognitive behavior therapy is essentially based on the concept that it's our thoughts which generate, you know, our moods.
Our negativity.
Yeah, not external stimuli, but our interpretation of those and our appraisal of those things. So we get into when we're in a negative state, we have all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking, you know, dysfunctional appraisals, let's say.
And you've mentioned things like psychotropic medication for the tougher cases where depression has gone out of control.
Yeah.
Is there a term for when depression gets really, really bad?
Well, textbooks tend to talk about psychotherapy as treating mild to moderate depression. But like, for example, as we mentioned earlier, there are cases where people have chemical imbalances and they tend to be more extreme, or they've experienced depression over longer periods of time, and it's become more compounded into their personality. Then sometimes there are talking therapies might not be seen as ideal, so they as a sole way of dealing with that problem. So then psychotropic medication, you know, antidepressants, so to speak, are introduced can be introduced as part of a treatment plan. If a person's been diagnosed, they're unwell, they're under the care of a sort of psychiatrist or psychiatric team, you know, and this is, or even GPs can actually,
so go to your GP.
Yeah.
So the first port of call for depression in terms of solving the problem.
Yeah.
Would you say it's the GP?
I would say it's a good protocol to sit down, make an appointment with you. If somebody's experiencing depression or they have a family member and they're concerned about experiencing depression, encourage them, or if you're the individual, to make an appointment with your GP and just have a conversation with your GP, someone you can trust, is confidential, about how you feel. It doesn't mean that you will be necessarily, because there are a lot of, how can you say, cliches or stereotypes about, oh, if I say how I'm feeling, I might be sectioned or carted off. But it's not as extreme as that. It's just a simple conversation with your GP, let him know how you feel, and he or she may raise the issue of medication, or he or she may say there's talking therapies available. I can refer you to see a psychotherapist, a counselor.
ECT in America, there are they say it causes minor seizures and impacts serotonin levels. Is that a dangerous thing?
From what I know, I've worked with a medic who swore by it. It's less used in England, Britain, should I say? In fact, I'm not even sure if it's still used. It's very much, you know, kind of frowned on, because it's basically electroconvulsive,
that's
shocks.
in the really, really extreme cases.
Yeah,
that's where it used to be used.
But from what I understand, in America, it's still one of the it carries less stigma, and as you mentioned, the electroshocks actually cause minor seizures. They've even been known to give it to pregnant women because, unlike medication, it doesn't, get into the bloodstream, and so it doesn't affect the unborn child.
That's a third level of formal.
But that would be from. I would see that as something that would be very extreme, somebody that's long term, and
somebody who's borderline mentally. What's the right word?
Not necessarily mentally incapacitated, but somebody who or somebody that's necessarily, but somebody that's got an extreme form of depression, and maybe with other medical mental health complications or mental health problems. So that may be one maybe one option, but very uncommon. Very uncommon.
Bringing it back to our communities again, and the Muslim community, and looking at Islam and its solutions, because you talked about thought.
Yeah.
It's a thought-based ailment, really.
Yeah.
And thinking and reflection, as we discussed in the last program, is something which Al-Quran inspires all the time through not only reading the Holy Quran, reading the verses, trying to understand them, causes reflection. If you're a thinker and if you bother to actually pay attention, that in itself, we could argue, has therapeutic effects. So the Quran as a potential therapy, a thought therapy.
Absolutely.
For people who are in depressed zones, who feel closed in on themselves, is that something that the ulama have recommended?
According to the shiyukh. There are specific ayat of Quran to read. That specific, from what I understand, the experts of this science, the urafa, they talk about specific ayats of Quran and when to read them, and to, particularly at night time. I guess from a biological level, the serotonin levels in the brain is operating on one level, but on a spiritual level, the soul, they say the soul is more calm. I've heard Ayatollahs discuss this. And you read certain ayahs and you reflect on them. So it may be not a case of reading whole passages. It might be the smallest ayah, a very short ayah, but it's the reflection and the contemplation and the inflection, and how does that relate to me in my life, and what's happening with me, and Allah is sending me a victory, or Allah is sending me a test, and it's for me to overcome this test. But when we read the Quran, we know that it discourages us from being sad and being in despair.
So this is an interesting, how the Quran is practically used in daily life, and modern day psychology, in a way, is looking into the mind and the emotions of human beings.
Yeah.
Well, the Imam Masumin were pretty much the experts at reading human beings,
For sure.
understanding human beings,
sure.
and being able to offer solutions. And there are, as we said, we'll hear from Maulana in a short while on some of the things and some of the verses that you can recite and under what circumstances. But it does seem as though there is a clear science to even the Quranic
For sure.
cures.
Yeah.
And have you had any experience of those as a psychotherapist? Have you ever utilized any of those with your Muslim clients, perhaps?
Well, there is a very interesting book called Don't Be Sad, which is a kind of must-have book for Muslim counselors, and for people, and for Muslims in general who are going through difficult times. It was referred to me by a clinician, a senior psychotherapist. He wasn't a Muslim, but just said this is basically explained to me. I went out and got the book. I got a hold of a copy from the library at work, but it's basically a book where the Sheikh is using specific Quranic ayats to deal with particular parts of the personality or particular parts of the mindset. So, for example, somebody that might be in a case of despair, and then he would quote the verse that says, with a hardship, there is hardship, and then there is ease. Verily there is hardship, but then there is ease. And then the Sheikh goes on to explain in the book that, we are hungry at times, very, very hungry, extremely hungry, but then it follows by we get nutrition, we get food, or we're tired and we feel distressed by tiredness, or we've been up and we've been working hard, but then there's a point where we sleep and we get rest. So letting us understand the yin and the yang, and that, Allah tests us with these different things, but then He's the one that will empower us with a victory at a particular point.
So let's move on to prayer. So we've talked about the Holy Quran as one method of healing yourself through thought, through reflection, and through inspiration from the words that the Quran fires back at us in terms of messages of hope and messages of a wider reality. Because often I think if somebody's gone in on themselves, then one of the things they're doing is they're not equating illusion and reality correctly. They're creating an illusionary reality for themselves based on their own thoughts, which makes them depressed. But if they were to see the bigger reality, and the wider reality is the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately, but then the beauty of the prophets and the Imam Masumin, these are all things of hope. And if somebody was to stop just looking at their own particular problems, but look at the wider picture, that in itself has a therapeutic effect. That if you're looking at the micro, you're so involved, and you forget what's really going on around you in the bigger world. If you were to be able to look at the bigger world, the bigger scene, would that be helpful?
Inshallah. I mean, as the Sheikh mentions in the book Don't Be Sad, he mentions or alludes to, it alludes to that sometimes people get caught up in their own thoughts, in their own smaller world, so that by looking at the Quran and what Allah is explaining to us, is giving us a wider context. So because as a human being, we can tend to become self-absorbed. The ego can lead us to become self-absorbed, and there is a risk of us actually thinking about things. It's not a reality, it's a fantasy, but our perception of it is so strong in our minds that we start to feel and start to operate on the basis of fantasy, not reality. So Allah is the real, and He's bringing us back to, by reading His word, we're connected in this sense of the guidance, and he's bringing us back to reality.
One verse which particularly comes to mind, or a whole chapter actually, is Surah Ar-Rahman, which constantly, the
Beautiful,
repetition
beautiful,
of
yes.
Which of the mercies of your Lord would you deny?
Absolutely.
I mean, it sounds to me like the ultimate, serotonin fix, if you like, from the Holy Quran. That you've got a verse which is reminding you of all the things that the Sublime gives you, and for somebody who's narrowed in and thinking about what they don't have, actually seeing what you do have is really important, and also perhaps looking at what other people don't have.
Absolutely.
If you're always looking at, and one thing that can depress people is in the rat race and in the materialistic race, somebody else has got a better car, better house, better wife, better whatever it is that and that invokes not only depression, but it's via jealousy, and jealousy itself is another issue that we'll deal with as an emotion in another program. But you could imagine that the verse Surah Ar-Rahman tells you quite clearly, look how much I've given you, and which of these mercies will you deny?
It's interesting you say that, because recently I was at Jummah and I bumped into one of my my ikhwan, like Prophet I've known for a very, very long time, and Assalamu alaikum, akhi, how you doing? And he said, what can I say apart from Alhamdulillah? He said, if I look around the world at how the mu'mineen are living, people who are not Muslim but just poor people, or difficulties that people are living, drone strike or military conflict or ethnic tensions or just no clean drinking water, all these things that people are facing day in, day out. And we live in Britain. If the world is divided into 10 portions, we're in economically at least, the most comfortable 10th, the first primary. I said, what apart from Alhamdulillah, what could I say to you, Bilal? And I just laugh, because he's one of them sobering moments, Yeah.
And on a final note, the thought springs to mind, Bilal, that often things are sent to test you. But in the Quran it says, we only put that burden upon you which you are capable of carrying.
Absolutely.
And the idea of trials and tribulations, or even things that people say or things that people do, if you put them into perspective, don't blow them out of proportion, don't get too egotistic about them, and understand that within the wider context of things, they're probably pretty meaningless. They may be hurtful things. People may say hurtful things, and it makes you depressed, or people may pick on things you're complexed about, or you have an inferiority complex about. But again, if you go back to the larger scheme of things and recognize just how beautiful you are as a human being, just how impossibly amazing as a creation you are, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kind of given you all those gifts.
And we don't despair for the mercy of Allah. We don't despair. We don't despair.
It seems to me that's the real message that I'd like to complete the program.
For sure.
One final word from you on depression and it's the way to heal it.
I would say, with all my training that I've been blessed by Allah to go into psychotherapy and learn techniques of counseling and psychotherapy, there are many ways that probably be on the remit of this show in a time. But I would say, even as a psychotherapist, the Quran is the shifa. So first, see the shuyukh, see the arif, and get those ayats to read at night.
Well, don't leave the Quran lying on your closets gathering dust. It's to be read. If you can't read it, you ask somebody to read it. Is a great way of doing it. Share the discussions around the Holy Quran. We ignore it far too often. I mean, I think we're all guilty of that. And actually, we're not taking the full benefits and the full shifa, as Brother Bilal has put it very succinctly. But on that note, I'd like to sign off this particular show on the note that depression is something that can be conquered both with your spiritual practice, but also you have the practical world, and these days the therapists and the psychotherapists and the GPs are your first point of call if you feel it's something that you're not being able to manage. The ulama are also there because they are also very adept at understanding psychological issues and matters of the heart and matters of the mind. I think it's also well worth consulting your local alims if you feel that they're good enough to be able to handle that sort of issue. But don't leave it lying around. Don't let it deal with you. You must deal with it. And go out there and get help. There's no shame in asking for help. We're all limited in one way or another, and certainly don't let the issue of depression bring you down. Assalamu alaikum. Khuda Hafiz.
La zona blanca.